Hey guys, welcome back, Fast Monty's Garage. It's been a long time coming for this video. It's time to install my dual disc clutch from Ram. Those of you that missed it, I did a Tremec TKX install and test drive about 5 months ago. And at the end of that video, I said, okay, my next project's gonna be this twin disc clutch install, and I never got to it because right after I filmed that test drive, I had no oil pressure in my engine and had to take it out. Had to do a full tear down and a rebuild of that. And if you want to check out that playlist, it's right there. But now the engine's back. And part of that process is you have to put the transmission back in the car. So why not film the installation procedure of this new twin disc setup from Ram? I've been dying to do this because my single disc was not holding up to my torque. I have 600 pound-feet of torque in this engine. And as those of you that might know, once you start creeping over 500 horsepower and up, a single disc is going to have a hard time holding that power. You start getting some chattering, etc., premature wear. So that's why I went with a twin disc setup. A twin disc, as you might imagine, there are actually two of these inside this system. That's double the surface area, which means you have less pressure plate force to maintain the same amount of torque. That means you get to save your knee. Now, if you really want to push the envelope on horsepower, this is the Ram 10.5 or Concept 10.5 they call it. The standard organic clutch will hold up to 750 horsepower. You can get a metallic lined clutch for 1,000 horsepower. Same setup. So we're going to go through the installation procedure today, what comes in the box. We do have to do some math and hopefully a test drive at the end of the video, which means my whole engine will be back running as well. So subscribe if you haven't seen that yet. It'll be fun. So let's go ahead and dive into what comes in the box. All right, what's in the box? What's in the box? All right, let's see. Oh, instructions. Well, got to read those like 18 times. We'll go through this real quickly. Very important step in there is we have to measure our distance from pressure plate to the bell housing, etc. But here's our first disc. Again, this is organic. You can also get metallic. Metallic is the 1,000 horsepower version. And this is a solid hub, as you can tell. The intermediate hub inside the pressure plate now is the sprung version, which is right here. It's already mounted inside, as you can see, and this absorbs vibration, so you don't get any gear chatter or rattle in your transmission. And it's already mounted in here. Now, this does not mean that you can just go ahead and throw this on top of the other plate. We have to take this apart and realign it and take some measurements, and we'll go through that. The other things in the box are mounting bolts. They're not only empirical, but they're metric too. How awesome is that? And an alignment tool. Now, something to keep in mind is Ram Clutches also has a billet version of this, which is actually really cool because you can install it one time and it doesn't have this rear end. It actually tapers and you can install the discs over it without removing this each time. And I'll remind you again later when we have to use this one because I don't have the billet one. Let's get into the flywheel I got. All right, guys, I mentioned earlier, this is the Concept 10.5 dual disc clutch. It can be mounted to almost any flywheel on the market. I elected to get a Ram flywheel, and for Pontiac guys, there are actually 3 different options. There's a standard version that's 35 pounds. There's a super lightweight aluminum version that's 17 pounds. And I got the lightweight steel version, which is 29 pounds. And you can tell from the part number, LW. But whatever car you have, make sure you look it up on Ram or give them a call, see what options they have for you. So let's tear into this box and see how pretty this looks. Oh yeah, look at that. That's so pretty. I love it. Obviously there's a warning on here. Make sure your flywheel holes match up to your crank. Duh. Let me show you the difference between this one and the flywheel I was using. All right, as you can tell, new one on the left, old one on the right. And it might be difficult to see, but the thickness is different. So this one is 930,000, and this one is 1.04. So the point here is this is probably clearly a standard weight flywheel, but what we want to look for is our distance from this surface. Actually, it's going to be the surface back here, but I'll show you the details when we mount it, between here and your throwout bearing, because we only have a limited amount of space and we have to measure that before we bolt everything together. In your instructions, there is a way to determine how much space you have within your bell housing. So you can just follow the instructions, measure the difference from your crank flange, how far it protrudes from your engine block, with the flywheel thickness and the clutch height. We're going to go ahead and take this apart now because we have to figure out the clutch height on the bench, and then we'll do it again in the car, and I'll show you the way I'm going to do it because I have a hydraulic throwout bearing. It's very critical we do all this, especially because I mentioned this is not centered. I actually just looked at it. The way it came from the factory, it's not centered. You guys see that? It's off center. So there's a good sign that it's not ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and take off these 6 bolts. Okay, I got the bolts out. Now notice there's some dowel pins here, so you might have to pry it up off the dowel pins like that. There we go. Notice our orientation. We have to put it back in the same position. You don't want those springs down. You want them pointed up. So while we're here, notice these 3 bolts. Do not, I repeat, do not take those apart. If you do, note that there are shims underneath. See this shim right here? Those are factory set to maintain the proper axial gap in between each disc. So don't take this apart. Just set it aside. All right, we got our flywheel. We're going to go ahead and put our fixed disc in, which is, it says flywheel side. Just so you know, I'm not guessing. And just line it up. And then we'll take our floater plate and we'll put it right on top of that. Now with the floater plate, you'll notice there's several different mounting holes, and that's for different cars. In your instructions, you'll have a different list of different cars. So on the 10.5, I have a GM with 3/8 inch bolts. So that's the blue holes. See that? I'm going to go around with my gray Sharpie and I'm going to mark those because that's going to come in handy later so we don't forget when we're actually under the car. I got my holes marked. Now grab your bolts that you need from the box. Check this out. These are precision ground on the OD, and in the counter bore there's the same precision hole, so it perfectly lines up this floater plate. So go ahead and put all your bolts in. All right, I got my bolts in place, and thinking out loud, I don't think the torque matters as long as it's tight, because there's no additional force that we're worried about as far as up and down goes. But make sure that OD on that bolt is sitting in the counter bore. If it's off center, the top of the bolt will be at or above the height of these standoffs. So make sure it's recessed. So go around, you can quickly feel that it's totally recessed. The other thing you're going to notice is this should be loose. Totally normal. That's how it's supposed to be. So when we're in the car, we're going to put this into our pilot bearing and we can line it up. But we're going to have to use both because the next step is putting our second disc on. Make sure it's just lined up. And now we can drop the pressure plate on. So I found my dowel pins and I'm just going to push it down. At least those dowel pins will help with our assembly in the car, so you're not fighting it. I can already tell. Now we get to put our bolts in, and we're going to go around to 26 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. You don't want to go around in a circle. You want to go back and forth. Make sure your torque is even. You even do 2 or 3 turns at a time until you get to your torque setting. All right, I'm all torqued down. Now you can take your alignment tool out, and you'll notice the fingers are depressed. Because when a clutch disc wears, in this case when 2 discs start to wear, these fingers actually go outward. So you need enough room, if you have a hydraulic throwout bearing, to accommodate for the clutch wear. And there's a formula in the instructions, we'll go through it. And we're going to start taking some measurements now. So go ahead and grab your calipers for the next step. Okay, our goal here is to measure our finger height from the workbench, which is down through the center of that hole. And what I'm going to do is I got this big washer, so I'm going to put this on here, centered right on the fingers. It works perfectly. And now I can just take my calipers and get a measurement, just like that. So take a few measurements, write them down, average them out if you have to, and we'll go and obviously subtract the thickness of that washer, and now you have your finger height. All right, I got my measurements right there. Averaged it 3342. So that's a data point, and that's basically this measurement here, B plus C. So I'm going to go ahead and take this whole thing apart, and we're going to measure our thickness of our flywheel and subtract the depth of the bore behind it. Be right back. Oh, the back side of this looks prettier than I thought. Didn't even look at that earlier. Looks awesome. But we need to measure this plane to this side plane. So I'm going to take my level. I'm going to have to do a visual on this one. So 150 sounds like a logical measurement. So we'll do 150 for that. Now we need a distance from the mounting flange on the crank to this machine surface on the block. And I happen to have that same surface is the same distance here. So I'm going to measure. Let's go back to the paper. So there's our math. So 700 thousandths from the crank to the engine plus 750, which is our flywheel thickness here after we measured our counter bore, subtracted our counter bore, plus the standard height of 350, plus 200 air gap is 4 on the nose, if you can believe that. So next step here is I'm going to actually get my bell housing out and transmission on the bench, and I'll show you guys how to measure the compressed distance here so we can fill in our equation, and we should have some available space. If not, we have a plan B. All right, guys, here we go. So I have obviously the bell housing mounted to the transmission, and this is my throw-out bearing, hydraulic. You can use your standard throw-out bearing to take these measurements as well, but it's more critical that we do it for a hydraulic throw-out bearing because our space is limited, basically. So we need to measure from this machine surface on our bell to this surface on the bearing. We're going to take two measurements. One is what we call free, so it's just out there, right? And then the second one we need to measure compressed, and that's going to take 3 or 4 hands, I'm assuming. So basically I got a straight edge, and I can take my calipers and easily take a measurement from the bearing to my level. So that's easy enough to do right there. So we're going to go ahead and write that number down. All right, sometimes you just have to outsmart the situation. So I actually was able to use one of my inspection cover bolt holes to hold the level down, and then at the top it's just taped against that machine surface. So now we have a reference, and now I can use my other hand and compress the bearing and get a measurement. Gotta love that. Let's go write that down. Got all of my measurements here and filled in some missing blanks and added some more dimensions, but basically according to the book or our little cheat sheet, I put in my numbers, and I got, you're reading that correctly, negative 300 thousandths. Yeah, that's not good. So I went through a little panic mode, and I discovered a huge issue is when I pushed in my throw-out bearing, it wasn't going all the way. So these are the actual numbers. So 3885 to 3890, that's 200 thousandths difference, which is basically a mile when we're referring to these numbers. So if we take basically 200 thou off this, so we would get 110 thousandths negative. That's still negative space, right, guys? So what you want here is like 150 thousandths ish or more to give you plenty of room for comfort as far as your clutch is concerned for wear. So how do we fix that? This is how we fix it. This is a spacer. It's a 1/4 inch thick, and it basically goes in between our bell housing and transmission, so that adds 250 thousandths to this number, which basically adds 250 to this number, plus 140. And I think we're in business because I think the spec is 125 minimum, at least for Silver Sport, where I got the throwout bearing from. I know that Ram would prefer to see 200 thousandths here, but in order to do that, you have to get like a saver plate that goes in between the bell and the block. A little more difficult to find. It's actually from QuickTime. Might say that for a later project, but that will give us an extra 125 thou. I have to make the executive decision, stay with the 140, and go from there. So let's jump in the car and put the flywheel on. Time to torque it down and time to wear gloves, because I just hit this with brake cleaner and it's already started to oxidize. That's a good sign. You want to clean this and wear your gloves so you don't put any unnecessary hand oil, finger oil on these surfaces. You're also going to want to clean the spacer plate that we're going to put on next. But those of you guys that have Pontiac engines, you want to pay attention to the length of fastener if you're changing flywheels. So my original flywheel was thicker, so it used these longer bolts. And don't use these bolts on here because they will bottom out. That shoulder will bottom out on the bottom because this is a thinner flywheel. So just pay attention to that. And we just torque these down to 95 foot-pounds. And those of you guys that need a trick, go ahead and put a breaker bar on the front crank bolt, leaning against the ground, so when you tighten these, the crank doesn't move. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We'll be right back and we'll put the floater plate on. I don't know if I mentioned it, but put thread locker on those threads before you torque them down. We're also going to put thread locker on these outermost holes because those line up with my floater disc mounting holes. And I like to put it in the hole. That way I don't have to worry about the screw. We'll go ahead and do all that. All right, time for our first disc. And remember, as marked, flywheel side. And we use our installation tool. Before you go any further, right here, especially on Pontiacs, make sure you can spin this without touching the flywheel bolts. I've seen some bolts that the heads are too large and will hit that disc. So this one doesn't have the springs in it. It's typically the ones with the springs in it will hit those discs, so just be careful. And while we hopefully it stays there while I grab the floater. And there's the floater. Remember we marked our holes. Putting the bigger of the bolts with that ground OD on and our marked holes. I already have thread locker in the bore. All right, remember what I mentioned about the bolts need to be recessed below this plate. That means you're all the way in. Thread locker, but most importantly, make sure you can move this disc around. If this is stuck or cannot move, you have a problem. Take it apart and start over. So let's go to the next step. We get to put the next disc on and the pressure plate. All right, this is probably the most challenging part because unlike a single disc clutch where we have two of these, we have to make sure they're both lined up and perfectly because it'll make the transmission install that much easier. Before I mentioned there's a billet version of this you can stick in here that's from Ram, and it doesn't have this assembly. It's actually tapered, so you can just slip the disc right over it, and it's has more precision, so it can't wobble around like that. I wish I had it right now, but I don't. So get one if you can when you do yours. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. So spring surface out. And I'm fully engaged with the pilot bearing, and notice how it can still move around. And that's what we have to pay attention to when we put our pressure plate on. And I forgot to mention earlier, these guys are just hand tight. They don't have to be torqued to a spec. The next bolts we're going to torque to 26 foot-pounds. So now we have to line up our dowel pins and see if we can do this with one person. All right, fully torqued down. This is how easy this should come out. See that? And back in. Nice. That's what we want to see. If it's too tight, you have misalignment in here between the two discs, and it might be difficult to get your transmission in. So we are good. Let's put the bell on and the transmission, bleed the clutch, see how that pedal feels. All right, bell's on. Those of you running a Silver Sport hydraulic throwout bearing, make sure you compress it as much as you can before you put the bell on. Otherwise, it's going to misalign itself. So right now, it's really easy to move around. See that? So as soon as you put the transmission in, it will line itself up. And that's the next step, the funnest part. Oh, I just spent like an hour of my life trying to put the damn transmission in, and it wasn't fitting. It wasn't going about the last half inch. I was getting super upset. I got the bell back off, retested with my alignment tool, and it fits totally fine, as I showed you earlier. So I took matters into my own hands, and I went ahead and cut the input shaft off the transmission. Don't worry, I'll put it back on there. Guys, I didn't hack it off. Come on, that was a joke. Oh, you can't take a joke, huh? So special shout out to Shane at Silver Sport Transmissions. I called complaining about me not getting the transmission in. He's like, Mike, you just need a killer installation tool. So he sent me this overnight. Thanks, Shane. Really appreciate you guys. Anyway, so let's go ahead and redo this situation with our alignment, but with the metal tool. All right, here's the difference. Remember our plastic install tool? This is fully engaged in the pilot bearing. Look how much we can move the discs around. I'll show you the steel one now. Okay, the steel one's fully engaged the pilot bearing. I can barely move this. So, oh my God, what a difference. So Shane, Silver Sport, thanks so much. Holy crap, this is going to be a lifesaver. All you guys out there, make sure you get the steel one. I just proved why. So next step, I got to torque this down around this perfectly positioned clutch assembly and get this transmission on. All right, moment of truth. Yes! We're in! Love it. All right, guys, I'm in the honest opinion that you absolutely need to get either the billet alignment tool from Ram or the cutoff input shaft from Silver Sport, because you're going to need it. I wasted way too much time, effort, swearing my ass off, and the transmission still didn't fit. Super duper lifesaver there. So make sure you get one, or that your kit comes with one. Now, I bled the clutch. Let's see how it feels. In all honesty, it kind of feels the same. So I did promise you guys a test drive. Now here's the issue. While I was under the car, my headers aren't on yet because I just put the engine in, and I noticed an issue I have to fix. And I've decided to change the way my headers attach to the X-pipe, and we're going to cover that next episode. I'm going with the Ultimate Headers low profile band clamps. I'm excited because that's going to seal up that union. You'll see what I'm talking about next week. But thanks for hanging out. Subscribe if you haven't, so we can follow along the fun and get this thing on the road. And then we'll go over how this shifts. So thanks for hanging out. Until next time, building fast, driving faster. See ya.